So we're going to start in exactly a minute. Thank you, everybody who's joined so far. Our goal with this call is to talk a bit about what we did in the last 2 weeks, cover a few quick updates, and then we are going to spend about 15 minutes discussing some of the new features that are coming around about JS editing, debugging, etc. So that's the idea behind this call. I'm just going to wait a few seconds more and then we'll get started. So today's call, Nikhil and I will be doing this call together. Nikhil is one of the co-founders of Appsmith. I'm sure a lot of you have already seen his face because he does most of our demos. And today he's going to be showing us some of our latest and greatest new features that are either out already or are on their way out. So let's get started. Today's main focus is going to be around the JS writing experience. And then we're also going to talk about a few other updates. We're going to keep this call pretty conversational and light. If any of you have any questions, please just either interrupt me by turning on your mic, or you can just leave a question in the chat and I'll pay attention to that. There's no clear set agenda here, so please go ahead and interrupt and contribute to the conversation or ask any questions. All right, so let's get started. So the first thing is a few new releases that we had over the last 2 weeks. Last 2 weeks have been quite busy. We've had about 3 new releases. Every few days we had a new release, and I think we have another one going out tonight. Some of the top 5 features that we released were, first, we introduced a debugger. You must have noticed that now there is a small drawer at the bottom of your Appsmith editor where you can actually see all the errors that your app has and easily find them and click them to go to the respective area and fix them. This was suggested by a community member. Actually, every single one of these things was suggested by a community member over the last few months. Then we have the multi-part form submit for file upload, and this is something that was again launched a few days ago. Again, a community feature, requested feature. We now have an early group action on our widgets. You can now use command click or control click on Windows to select multiple widgets and delete them. Within the next couple of releases, we will be upgrading this feature so that you can actually move widgets around, copy paste them anywhere you want, and do other actions. So as of today, you can select them, you can delete them or copy paste them, but you can't move them around. And that feature should be out very soon. We have another feature where you can download your table data as Excel. This was requested by Luke, who's one of our earliest users of Appsmith, and we just released this. CSV, of course, already used to exist, but now we let you do Excel downloads as well so that you just get a little more control over the way the data is being downloaded. The fifth one has been a long requested feature, which is a form-based query builder for MongoDB. We have a query builder for MongoDB, which can be a little bit difficult to use if you're not used to writing Mongo queries. And constantly we had people struggling with batch size and some of these other nuances of the Mongo query building. So we've now introduced a form-based way of building a query so that you run into fewer errors, and it's a lot easier for you to get what you need without needing to deal with batch size and other things. So these are some of the main highlights. We have a bunch of others which you can go check out our release notes either on GitHub or inside the Appsmith homepage for. So let's move on to the next one. So 2 weeks ago, we did the product roadmap jam. We had about 40 people who left comments and participated on the product roadmap during the call and as well as a few days after the call. This roadmap is still live, by the way. So if you've missed it, you should go ahead and check that out. The link is available on our Discord. So we had about 40 people who participated and helped us prioritize a lot of these features. So now I want to talk about the top 5 features that were requested for in this product roadmap discussion. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of them, and then we're going to talk in greater depth about some of the most important ones. So starting off with the first one, import and export of apps and Git sync. This has been a feature request that has been showing up on our Discord as well as GitHub issues for a few months now. I know a lot of you first start using Appsmith on your local machine, and then you go ahead and either start using the cloud edition or you self-host Appsmith on your cloud instance. And it's been quite difficult for you to move apps around, especially if you've built something complicated. So this is a feature. We actually started working on it about a week ago, and one of our team members, Abhijit, he's been working on this quite actively, and he should have an update for us all over the next couple of weeks. This is obviously a little complicated feature with a lot of potentials for pitfalls, so we are spending a lot of time testing it, but it's definitely going to be out in a couple of weeks. The second part of it, which is Git sync, this is something that again has come up a few times. Around this feature, we've been doing a lot of user interviews and trying to understand what's the best possible experience that we can provide for Git sync as well as for local development. And over the next month, we're going to design and identify like a good feature around this one so that we can then start working on it. But we're thinking very hard about it. The next feature that kept coming up was developer environments, so that you can have staging, prod, and as many environments as you need. This is something we'll start working on the next quarter. Here, this is probably going to be a feature that's going to be part of our enterprise or paid edition. We are still figuring that out, but we still don't have a clear timeline on when this is going to be released. The third one was import any NPM library. Today, Appsmith ships with a couple of libraries, notably Lodash and Moment, but we've had requests for people to use other libraries. For example, like Moment is now deprecated and no longer being maintained, so we need to replace that with a different library. So we'll soon let people import any NPM library so that you can access all the JavaScript functions that are not native, so that you can just do any kind of complicated, write any kind of complicated logic that you would like to. This is again something that we'll be picking up sometime in the next quarter. We don't have a clear idea of what the exact spec of this feature will look like, because this is a feature that can lead to a lot of security loopholes, but we know where this feature is going to show up. If you look at the Entity Explorer at the bottom left, there is already a section that says JS libraries that you can use. And what you're going to see is there's going to be a new plus button there so that you can just import any library. So the user experience is going to be fairly simple, but we're going to build this keeping in mind all the security loopholes that can arise as soon as you start using JavaScript libraries. The fourth one, linting and better debugging. This is like the second highest requested feature, and we've been hearing about this for a really long time, because one of the things about writing JS or writing SQL queries is that you often don't know if you've missed a semicolon or a comma somewhere or an apostrophe or double quotes. And it gets quite painful to identify where you've made an error if you don't have access to good linting, as well as an access to a good debugger. This is something we are actively working on. Debugger is a feature where we have the first version that has already launched, and Nikhil is actually just going to demo that in a minute. And linting is something that we are working on right now as a part of our JS editing feature. The debugger should rapidly improve over the next few weeks. The linting feature, you should see an early version of it in the month of June, once we have a better handle on the GS editor. But we are working on this quite actively. The final feature, which really was the most popular one, was bigger space for JS. Today, writing JS in Appsmith requires you to write everything in that tiny little space on that property pane, where it's really difficult for you to firstly reuse a function that you've written at other places. The second thing is it's just a too small a space for you to write anything and read that out later, or to do any sort of like code reviews if you have a colleague helping you out. So this undoubtedly, this showed up as the most requested feature, and we are working on this. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand it off to Nikhil to first talk a little bit about the debugging experience and demo the new debugger that we've launched. And after that, Nikhil is going to talk a bit about how we are thinking through the JS editing experience and all the designs that we worked on for this experience to come live. So I'm going to just hand it off to Nikhil.
Thanks, Abhishek. Awesome. So I'm going to share my screen now. And yeah, so I'm going to demo this on one of our Appsmith applications. And when we kind of looked at the debugging experience, the way we thought about it is that to debug errors on Appsmith, we have to first classify the type of errors that there are. And looking at the type of errors, we largely saw that some of them were around the actions that were there on the platform. When you're trying to run an API, you encounter an error. When you're trying to run a query, you might encounter an error. Or you might also encounter an error inside a widget. And that's typically related to JavaScript. Now, inside the widget, there are two types of errors that you can encounter. One being that you have a data type mismatch error. An example of this could be that you have a table over here. And if you'll notice that the table expects a data type of an array of objects, right? But what happens if you don't provide this data type? You typically going to see an error like this. That's going to tell you that, hey, it does not evaluate a type array of objects. So that's one type of error. The other type of error on the platform is a JavaScript error, right? Which is when you're writing JavaScript, you might sort of maybe misspell a variable. Instead of saying fetch users, you may just say fetch user, right? So this is another type of error that may occur on the platform, which is typically a syntax type of error. And the third type of error on the platform is a logical error, where everything is working fine, syntactically it's correct, but somehow your application logic is doing something unexpected, right? So we thought, how can we go about enabling users to kind of debug all of these errors and make for a better coding experience in Appsmith? So let's begin with the first type, which is creating an API. So let's create something called fetch users over here. And I'm just going to hit our mock API saying mock api.appsmith.com. And the first type of error is probably something like where we maybe misspell instead of fetch users, I'm hitting the wrong endpoint, I'm hitting just user. And this gives me an error right now. Now, looking at the errors tab, what's happening here is that we can actually debug what exact request went out, because sometimes it could be that there are additional headers that aren't seeing that are going out, which is causing our backend to fail. Sometimes it could be that a particular param is not being sent correctly, and in this case, as we can see, it's a 404 not found, and we can see that that's probably because the URL is incorrect. So I can probably just fix that by changing this to fetch users. So now the errors disappeared and we know we're in a successful state. Once we look at our response, we can see that, okay, we've gotten the data and everything is working fine. So it's a lot easier to kind of fix problems like that. Now let's take the example of the table again. A really common error that we see is that when a user tries to bind an API to a table, let's call it fetch users.data, they typically encounter this error trying to wonder, why does the data not match a type JS? Now, really what's happening is that the array is inside the JS object. So sometimes it's difficult to kind of grok this, but hitting the debugger and opening this, we can actually begin to search for what went wrong here. Why is this error there? And to do this, we realize that our documentation is also able to play a big part of the developer's experience and help them debug these errors. So we've gone ahead and documented all of these errors inside our documentation and allowed users to kind of search for all these errors in one place. So right now we can have a look at this example, which is actually the same example that I'm demoing, of a response where the array is in a nested format. And we have also mentioned a clean solution to say that to overcome this, we can bind the array using a binding like this. So it becomes really easy for a user to kind of just take the binding from there, debug the error, and kind of fix it immediately over here. So some of the errors which are system invocable that can tell you right on the spot what's wrong, you can go ahead and use the debugger instantly for it. And some of the errors which maybe the system can't aid you with, you can also go ahead and grep through the documentation right from the debugger to figure out what the solution is. Now, the other kind of error that also is debuggable, let's take the example of a query. And I'm going to call this, let's say, another, let's say let's call this get users. And in this case, maybe I want to fetch all the users based on the values of a dropdown. So let's take a dropdown from here. And let's add various roles like, let's say, admin, and let's say viewer. So now the spelling mistake for admin is actually intentional in this case. And what I'm going to do is now I'm going to fetch for users where the role is taking from the selected option value, right? I'm just going to go ahead and run this. Now, oddly enough, it says no data records to show. And this is happening, as we know, because the data being sent to the query is wrong. But sometimes it's really hard to grok why it's wrong because there's no visible error on the screen. To the system, this is a valid query, right? But what we can do, and as you can see here as well, there are no errors. But what we can do now is actually make use of the log history. So log history is a list of all the actions that a user took on the platform. And using this, we can debug what actually went out on the request. So looking at the request over here, the request params, we can see the actual value that went out. So we can see that, okay, in our query, select star from users where the role is equal to admin. So we know that, okay, there was a logical error that happened. It wasn't a system error, but more of a logical error. So we can just go ahead and easily correct that inside our code. And doing that will now enable us to run this query effectively. Did I? Oh, sorry, I've left this as admin. Yeah, there we go. Yeah. So this is another type of error that the debugger really helps us kind of fix on the spot. And as you're looking at the logs, the really useful part of the logs is that you can always have a look of every single action that was taken on the platform. So you can also debug that what properties were updated, when they were updated, and how these different widgets are interacting with each other. So at any point in time, if you're confused as to why did making of one particular widget change affect some data or affect another widget, it's really easy to just go down to the logs and have a look at what went wrong over there. The other really great thing is that if there is an error somewhere in the middle and you've somehow missed it, we also kind of highlight it to you so that you're always aware of all the list of errors in your application so that before you hit deploy, you can be sure that your application is in a working state. Now, some of the new upcoming enhancements to this debugger are going to be around the JS writing experience, in fact. So let's take the example of us writing a query, right? So let's actually create a query right now. So I'm going to call this query again, fetch users, let's say. And now let's for a moment say that we're going to bind this query to the table. But typically what also happens sometimes is that maybe I misspell my query and I say fetch users.data, right? Now, today, what generally happens is it just gives you an error saying that this does not match the type array of objects, but it doesn't tell you what actually went wrong. And this is a great advancement that's coming up. If you can see over here, it's going to tell you that fetch users is not defined. So what's happening now is that we're also propagating errors from the underlying JavaScript layer and figuring out all of the mistakes while you're writing code. Another simple example of this could be that sometimes we try to transform an object or rather map over an object that is not an array, right? So let's take an example of a direct key value map and try and write a map function out of it, right? So for example, here it's telling me clearly that, hey, map is not a function. So this clearly tells me that, hey, probably what you're doing is incorrect. This is not a function on a valid data type, and you kind of need to fix this over here. So this is a really cool enhancement that's coming up, propagating all of the JavaScript errors as well into the debugger. And the next step to this enhancement is also going to be to enable linting. Because now that we know all of the JavaScript errors, we're also going to be able to display those errors with a lint highlighter inside the code editor as well. So that's the next enhancement that's going to come up with the debugger. And the last enhancement is going to be in terms of showing the relationships between the different entities. So because Appsmith is reactive, almost every entity, whether it's a widget, an API, or a query, has a dependency as soon as it's bound. And sometimes it can become a little difficult to understand where the data for a widget is actually coming from, or where certain interaction with the widget is actually pushing data to. So we're going to also allow you to inspect any element on the screen, whether it's an API or a widget, and allow you to see the different relationships that are either updating that entity or that entity is updating, and quickly navigate between them. That's also a really cool enhancement that's coming up soon. So yeah, these are some of these are some of the new enhancements to the debugger, and this is what the debugger currently looks like today.
Uh, Thanks, Nikhil. So some of the features that Nikhil just showed you, they are currently on our release. They should be out either this week or early next week. So let's go talk about the JS editor feature. So first, Nikhil, why don't I start off with asking you a question? What have you been, why is JS so important in Appsmith, and what are the problems that people have been facing with it today?
I think JS is really important in Appsmith because it's what really makes us super unique. You know, custom internal tools, even though we have a really nice visual builder where you can drag and drop, create UI, you can configure APIs, uh, a lot of it is really taken away from you. But because internal tools are so custom, you always need to be able to write a bit of code and JavaScript to be able to go the last mile and configure different logical workflows. So the way we look at it in Appsmith is that things which are static and can be defined visually, those should kind of always be edited visually. But things like logical expressions, which are really hard to grok visually, those can continue to be written via code. And that's why JavaScript is so important in Appsmith, because it gives you the freedom to configure your applications any way you want. On the click of a button, you can describe pretty much any behavior, whether it's to open a modal, whether it's to navigate to another page, whether it's to update an API. You can pretty much describe any kind of behavior or logical expression through code. And that's why JavaScript is really, really important.
Got it. Tell me a little bit about what kind of research you've been doing around improving the JavaScript writing experience.
Awesome. So yeah, I think there's no doubt that this is one of our most requested community features, and some of the things that we've heard from the community and we've experienced ourselves has been that it's really difficult to write JavaScript in a small box, or rather any code for that matter, simply because there's not enough place to format that code. Code has a structure to it that you need so that you can read it very simply and also catch a lot of your mistakes. A simple example would be a few weeks ago when I was doing a demo with the Gmail API. There was a small comma that was missed in my code, and it was really difficult for me to find that out. And that's typically because the code isn't formatted. There's not a large enough space for you to actually format your code correctly and have a look at where you've made that mistake, right? The second problem is that there's no linting today, which means that you don't know that if you've missed a full stop, whether you're using a wrong method, whether maybe some data isn't defined. Because code has such a dynamic nature, a lot of times having a linter will just enable you to avoid all of these simple syntactical errors that you should be not making. And this is something that's very native to the coding experience. This is something that a lot of users are very used to, simply because they write code in VS Code, in IntelliJ, and all their favorite IDs. And this is currently missing in Appsmith today. So that's another big feature that people have been requesting for us. The third is that while our APIs and our DB queries can be run on page load, you cannot write JavaScript on page load, unfortunately, today. Some of the good use cases for this are when you're trying to maybe store an authentication token For example, as soon as a user lands on a page, you might try to authenticate that user and then redirect them to a login page. Or if they are authenticated, then fetch the cookie from the local storage and use that for your API calls. You might want to maybe pull data from 2, 3 different data sources and then merge them together before they're ready to actually be used. Unfortunately, unlike APIs and queries, you cannot write JavaScript on page load today. And having a JS editor will also enable us to do that. The fourth problem that we came up with was around reusability. Having multiple widgets all across the board and having APIs and queries in different formats, a lot of times you simply want to write a transformation function on top of the data that's being returned, because a lot of times the data format you store things in does not match the data format that you want to display them in. A simple example could be that dates are typically stored as epoch milliseconds, but when you want to display them, you typically want to display them in a nice human readable format, right? So allowing you to kind of write JavaScript and transform that data is possible today. But unfortunately, if you have to use that data in multiple widgets, you have to go on rewriting this JavaScript for every single widget. And that makes it very, very cumbersome and very, very repetitive. So allowing reusability was a big part of improving the JS experience as well. Sorry, Abhishek, what you saying?
Yeah. So why don't we just go dive in? I think they were great points. Why don't we go dive into the prototypes and early designs of the JavaScript editor, and then I have a few more questions that I'm going to ask you then.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, let me share my screen. Cool. So this was one of the use cases I was just talking about, which is transforming data. So the way we look at this is that typically users have configured their APIs or their queries. They've then gone ahead and run them. They've brought them to the table, and now they generally want to add a transformation. It could be that maybe you want to filter out the data in your APIs. In this example, I'm going to show you that a user has fetched some users, but some of the users don't have the ID field set. So they just want to simply filter out those users. So what they can do is here, we've introduced a new type of autocomplete, which is going to be invoked via slash commands, sort of like how you do on Slack. So invoking something like slash or just focusing on the field will open up this autocomplete that will give you multiple options. You can create APIs from here, as well as you can create JavaScript functions, and you can connect to your existing data sources and APIs from here. So clicking new JS function, what it does is it basically creates a new JavaScript file. And this JavaScript file is a class file. So the name of the JavaScript file is the name of the class file. And this class file can have multiple methods. By default, it has a run method where you can write this JavaScript. And inside this class file, the experience is very close to your native VS Code experience, where you will have linting, syntax highlighting, all of those, the autocomplete, all of the features that you're very comfortable writing code with. The other really cool thing about Appsmith, which we've also kept, is the ability to see the evaluated value. So at the bottom of the screen, as you're writing the code and changing values, you're still continuing to see the evaluated value update in real time. And I think this was one of the recent comments that a user left us on the JavaScript editor Epic. So once the user has now, let's say, written the fetch users API and created this JavaScript file, he can simply write fetch users.data, go ahead and write, let's say, a filter function over that data and return that data inside this function. And similarly, he can access all of the variables inside this JavaScript file itself. And once he's done with that, once he closes the JavaScript file, he's able to now bind this data directly to the table. And over here, instead of referencing the fetch users.data, he's now referencing the JavaScript file, which is transform users.run. So over here, he's referencing to the transform users class and also to the run function inside of it. So this is one case of transforming data. And because it's there in a separate file, this can also be used by multiple different tables and charts and different things like that. The second use case was around creating a workflow. If you look today to kind of trigger different actions, you have on success and an on error, right? But unfortunately, because the property pane has a limited space, the depth of this on success and on error is going to be limited, right? And writing JavaScript is not the best solution inside the property pane. So consider the case of a refund API, which then needs to trigger an update order, right? It's easy to configure these two to run on a click and then on success. But let's say you want to trigger an email now. To do this, you can simply click add a step. Adding a step will then again go ahead and create a new JavaScript file for you. This file, let's say we're calling it the workflow file, which is the workflow class. And here again, you can write a run function. Now, what's slightly different about this run function is that You're also going to be able to access promises. And this is something that we're doing, which is going to be a slight change in the underlying Appsmith architecture, where today the way to add callbacks to APIs and queries is by passing in a callback function to the run parameter. But now what we're going to do is actually implement promises inside our underlying JavaScript layer so that every run function automatically returns a promise to you. So what we're now going to be able to do is call multiple APIs right over here, and then chain all of them together to make sure that all of them are running in parallel and that the function only completes once all of them are actually there. So we'll also have a promise.all that does this. And while we are continuing to write this, we'll also be able to see the response of this of these promises in real time. So as you can see over here, the promise for refund and promise for order is still not done. So these are still running. But because the email sent promise has completed, this automatically gets updated. Once the promise for order also completes, that as well will be reflected over here. So it continues to be real time, and you continue to be able to inspect all of the data that you're actually seeing over here. And once you're done with creating this workflow, once you come back, you'll see that the button now is simply on click, just calling the workflow.run. So now rather than having to call all of the APIs directly in the button, you're only calling the JavaScript function, which is then internally calling all of these different APIs. So it becomes a lot easier to configure as well. So that's one of the use cases for creating workflows. The third use case which we talked about, which was running pages on running code on page load. So here you can create a JavaScript function, let's say from the Entity Explorer. And once you create a JavaScript function here, you can go ahead and actually define various different properties inside the class file. So you can create, for example, a users object as well as a roles object, just like how you would in JavaScript. And inside the run function, we can go ahead and call the fetch users.run as well as the fetch roles.run. And only when both of these succeed, we can go ahead and update the data of users and roles. So over here, if you'll notice, we are actually making use of an asynchronous mechanism of joining these two data and trying to ensure that the initializer class is going to have the data of the users as well as the roles from two separate APIs together. And once this data is, once this function is then written, we can simply mark this JavaScript function to run on page load. And we also have multiple other options for the JavaScript file. So we can say that, do you want to have a request for confirmation, as well as we can add a timeout on it as well, because maybe we don't want the combination of both these requests to run for longer than a particular time period. We can control that as well. And once that's sort of done, we can directly access the data of the JavaScript file. So one difference you'll notice over here is that in the previous examples, we were directly calling the data for the transformer.run. And this was possible because it was a synchronous function. It was returning data directly from the run function. But over here, what's different is that this is an asynchronous function calling multiple promises. So instead, we're referring to a synchronous variable inside the JavaScript file. And this variable will automatically be populated whenever the JavaScript function has run and all the APIs have returned data. So whenever the file initialize users gets the data, automatically the table will also update because Appsmith is anyway reactive. The other use case that I was about to talk about was defining constants. So a lot of times you want to have certain constant variables in Appsmith that you want to reuse in multiple places. A simple example could be that while I'm fetching our users, I want to define a limit to the number of users. Now, typically you will just hard code this as 10 inside your application, but sometimes you want to make sure that this is a global variable that can be changed from a single place so that maybe it is consistent across all APIs. So to do this, we can make use of the autocomplete again and create a JavaScript function. And simply put, inside this class, we can go ahead and add two separate constants, limit and let's say order by. And because two separate constants are there, we can also see their evaluated values. So how our evaluated value now works is that every single data and function of the class file is now under evaluation. So you can inspect all of the data elements inside the class file, as well as you can inspect the response of every function in the class file over here. So the limit and the order can be inspected. And if you had a run function, you'll be able to inspect that as well. And once that's done, you can simply refer to your JavaScript class name .limit or .order right from this place. And because it's in a single point now, if you update the limit, you can go, it will automatically reflect for every single API that's referencing to it. So this again comes back to reusability and being able to do more with JavaScript. And lastly, you can also organize your functions, because it's not comfortable to only have one function in a class file. Sometimes you might want to have multiple functions in a single JavaScript class file. You might want to organize them inside a certain structure. So to do that is also possible. You can go ahead and let's say I've taken the same filter example and I've simply separated out the two functions. I've created a filters users, which is actually doing the filtering of data. And I've added a simple map inside the run, which is just going to map over the users that are filtered and then return the ID over there. And because we have two functions now, we can see two evaluated values over here. So we can also inspect that maybe something didn't go wrong with the run. Maybe something went wrong with the filter users. Maybe I want to look at what happened over there. So we can also inspect at each function individually, as well as we can also call them from different class files. So if we have a separate class inside this application, that class can also invoke this class's functions as well. So that way, all of these functions are now reusable and can actually be used anywhere inside the application. So for example, over here, we're using transform users.run, but somewhere else we can also refer to transform users.filter. So that will also be possible inside this entire application. Uh, and right now, I think one of the biggest underlying changes we are making is that we will be able to create asynchronous functions anywhere in Appsmith. So you can create a new promise and run it in a separate thread inside Appsmith. And that will make it a lot easier to spawn different workers, run long running jobs. The only caveat which will come in V2 will be the implementation of async and await. So async and await have a bit of implementation challenge because they are reserved keywords. So we are going to begin by implementing the promise system first and then introduce async and await second. So these are some of the changes we are planning to introduce inside our JavaScript editor.
This sounds great. Thanks, Nikhil, for that really good demo. Are you going to share this Figma file on Discord later?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, that's really cool. Now, tell me a little bit about when it came to designing the flow around the JavaScript experience. What are the things that Appsmith is doing that is only possible because we are in the browser, and not and because, like, it's a tool that's available on the cloud. So, is there anything that we are doing differently?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of our best and brightest features is that everything is real time, and you don't have to compile to figure out errors, and that's something that we are constantly leveraging. So we've taken this to the next level. In fact, in the JavaScript editor, where if you look in a table, you can only see the table's evaluated value. But because the JavaScript editor is so much richer, and the class file can have multiple variables as well as multiple functions inside of it, we're actually extending this and enriching this so that you can inspect the value of every single variable inside that class file. So this will allow you to debug errors with much better efficiency and allow you to create more complex class files without having to worry about a new user trying to understand how does this class file work. Because as soon as they come here, they're able to see the variables up front, they're able to inspect the values of all variables, and they're able to easily debug their errors. So this is like a huge leap forward for writing JavaScript.
That sounds great. Now, on our Discord as well as on our intercom and email, we often get a lot of user requests around JavaScript errors that they face, or asking for help around how to write JavaScript. What are you doing about addressing that?
Yeah, great question. I think so. We actually spoke to a couple of these users, and we figured that it came down to two real things. One is that users aren't used to writing single line JavaScript, and that's kind of the unfortunate downside of writing JavaScript in the property pane, where because you're writing the JavaScript for a single property, you're writing everything in a single line, and that can be quite confusing for people who typically are used to writing multi-line JavaScript. And we've addressed this in this editor because, as you can see over here as well, I could have just said fetch_user.data.filter, which is what typically we do in the property pane. But how we've simplified this is now inside the JavaScript editor, you can actually define different constant variables and store intermediate states, allowing you to write more full-fledged multi-line code, which is easier to debug, easier to read, and easier to understand. So that's going to be a huge leap forward in terms of making it easier to write JavaScript. The second problem that we're going to be solving is in terms of code formatting. a lot of code simply doesn't execute because you miss a lot of tiny mistakes that you made, and you can't catch these mistakes if your code isn't well formatted. So this JavaScript editor is going to have really great formatting and linting rules to make it easy to read the code and debug the errors. So whenever there is a syntax error, a linting symbol is going to show up near that location and tell you that at this line, at this position, there is an error, and tell you what the error is as well as because the code is really well formatted, you're going to be able to read it and debug the errors much better. So these are the things we're doing around it.
Okay, thank you, Nikhil. Now I'm going to open it up for any questions our audience might have about this or anything else that you heard about today or anything else that we can help you with. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and turn on your mics and ask them, or you can just type them out in the chat here. Okay, I'm going to wait another few more, maybe like 30 more seconds, and then we'll end the call. While we wait for questions to come in, the recording of this video will be available on YouTube if you want to just see the demo again, as well as our YouTube channel has been quite active. One of our developer relations person, Confidence, he's been posting regular tutorial videos about how to use widgets and how to use other things. So please do go check that out. If you've already signed up for our Discord, please go check out some of our new channels there. One of them is research, where our design team will keep polling questions, and they also use that channel to share some of their early work. So do check that out. I know Discord has gotten quite a bit noisy over the last few weeks, but you should definitely pay attention to that channel. You should also take a look at our latest GitHub README. We've given it a new coat of paint. It looks quite a bit different than it used to look before. So please go do check that out as well. Okay, folks, I don't see any questions, so we're going to just go ahead and end the call. Thank you so much, Nikhil, and thank you so much, everybody who joined us today. We're going to keep doing regular community calls where we're going to show you a preview of what's coming up for Appsmith, as well as there's going to be a few more calls where we're going to discuss the product roadmap and like take advice on our upcoming features. So please do keep an eye out for those in your email or on Discord. And for now, I'm going to say goodbye. All of you have a great day. Take care. Bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.